Well, hello and welcome. I'm Mark Mallalieu. I work for the Sussex Ornithological Society and I'm a keen amateur ornithologist. I spent 2 years living in the centre of Kabul in Afghanistan under extreme security constraints, much more severe than recent lockdown restrictions in the UK. So I thought I'd tell you the story now, just as we're hopefully starting to move out of lockdown in the UK. And when I say extreme, I really mean that. Almost all the photographs of birds that I'll show you in this talk were taken in or from an area of 50 by 50 square meters. In fact, when I first flew to Afghanistan, I took no binoculars with me. I thought I'd be too busy to study birds, and there wouldn't be any opportunities, even if I had any free time. It was going to be frustrating, as I knew that Kabul appeared to be on or close to a major flyway for migratory birds. One thing I'd like to say at this point is that, as you know, Afghanistan faces huge political, security and developmental challenges. My time there was spent trying to improve the lives of its people. So the bird study that I attempted may seem rather trivial in relation to the issues that are confronting the country, although I tried in a very small way to engage young people in conservation issues, and the organisation I worked for helped the United Nations Environment Programme with their efforts at conservation work. So here we go. If you want to ask questions, you see there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So just click on that and type in any question you have, and we'll deal with them at the end of the talk. The way I've set it up is that other people can't see what questions you ask. I don't think that matters, but we will answer them at the end of the talk. So where is Afghanistan? Well, it's sometimes described as being in Central Asia, sometimes in South Asia. There it is. And one thing I want to say straight away is that funny tongue of land on the right-hand side of the country, the eastern side, is the Wakhan Corridor, which was agreed between the British and the Russians during the Great Game. It was a way of ensuring that there was no border between British India and the Russian Empire. So I said that Afghanistan was an important migratory flyway. Why is that? Well, that's because South Asia, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh are a hugely important wintering ground for millions of birds that breed further north in Asia. And you can see from this map that it looks as if many birds, if they were going to Central Asia or Western Asia or Eastern Europe, might fly through Afghanistan. And also the blue arrow that I'm showing there isn't actually pointing to Afghanistan. Well, in addition to pointing to Afghanistan, it's also pointing at Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. And I lived in Islamabad in the 1980s, and I will refer to Pakistan once or twice because living there gave me some clues as to what birds I might see in Kabul. So that's the sort of area that birds migrating north through Afghanistan might be going to in the summer. Where might they be coming from? Well, some of them were coming from as far as Sri Lanka, going to the Caucasus and even Turkey. Some of them were going from Southeast India to the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, Western Russia, Scandinavia. Some of them were flying from Rajasthan up into Northwest Russia, and others from Gujarat into central Russia, east of the Urals. And also a much smaller population, I believe, certainly fewer species, migrate to and from Africa and Central Asia. So there's this kind of movement as well in both directions. However, it was going to be a frustrating time for me because of the security constraints. And I didn't know when I went there whether I'd be able to experience any of this tremendous migration at all. And you can see from this photograph that that's the sort of gear I had to wear whenever I went out of Kabul, which wasn't particularly often, but you know, armored protection. I'd be in an armored vehicle and I'd be protected by heavily armed personnel. So it wasn't the sort of conditions in which you can birdwatch. I'm just going to pause for a moment because I see there are 3 questions already. I'm just going to ask my colleague Martin that if there are any that I need to know about, perhaps he could let me know. But assuming that's not the case, I'll just continue.
Oh, Mark, somebody's having problems with the sound breaking up. And somebody else has had problems with the map not showing on the screen. But I've seen no other reports.
Okay, I'll go a little bit slower because it may take time for some of these things to show. Okay. Cheers. So this was my study area, or most of it, a very small area, a garden, and I used to watch from the balcony behind those grills, believe it or not. And the bird ringing that I eventually did, you can just about see a furled mist net there. And that's a 6-meter mist net. And if any of you are ringers, you will know that that's not a particularly good site for a mist net. And it's not brilliant just to have one small net, but that was what I was faced with. And almost all of the photographs of birds that you'll see were taken in or from this garden. And almost all the birds that I'll show you in the hand, ringed birds, were caught in that net there. So I arrived in winter, and these were some of the birds that I found when I arrived. Top left, I was actually quite pleased to see abundant tree sparrows, and they were the urban sparrow. There's also the Indian race of house sparrow, Indian sparrow in Kabul, but funnily enough, that was more on the sort of fringes, whereas the tree sparrows were right in the center of the city. Bottom left, those are laughing doves, they're common. Miners were common, for example, as well. And then if you look top right, bramblings, and bottom left, bottom right, chaffinches. These were pretty scarce, and they're close to the edge of their wintering range in Asia, the southeast edge of their wintering range. And indeed, I also saw a few greenfinches, and they were actually beyond the known wintering range for that species. It was a range extension of several hundred miles. But looking over Afghanistan around Kabul from the air, it's extraordinarily bleak. Nothing seemed to be growing in the late winter and very early spring, and the mountains were covered in snow. And it seemed difficult to understand how birds, particularly small migratory birds, could travel across this area to their breeding grounds further north in Asia. And if you look at a map there of Afghanistan, you can see Kabul, and behind it, that chain of mountains, which are really a western, the Hindu Kush and ranges beyond the Hindu Kush, form a kind of western extension and limit of the Himalayas. They're not as high as the Karakoram and the Himalayas, but they're still very formidable mountains, certainly even viewed from Kabul in the winter when they were covered in snow. One thing that gave me some grounds for hope that I might see some migrants in Kabul was that most of the trees are indigenous to Afghanistan and Central Asia. There are many Siberian elms, Caucasian ash, Turkish pines, abundant fruit trees, walnut trees, and very few exotic trees, one of which is the tree of heaven, which you're a botanist, you may know about, Ailanthus altissima. That's actually the out of focus tree in the bottom right of the picture. That is a noxious weed, and it causes considerable problems in some parts of the world. It's originally from China, but certainly in the United States, for example, it's regarded as a noxious weed. Anyway, all those indigenous trees, which you can see there in early spring in Afghanistan, did give me some grounds for hope. But there we are. There's looking out from my balcony through those grills. And that was my migration watch point, believe it or not, for 2 years. So late winter, early spring, beginning of March, middle of March, I saw no migrants whatsoever. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Third week in March, still absolutely nothing. And by that stage, I'd almost given up. Thought I'd made a good decision not to bring my binoculars. But the weather had been absolutely beautiful, blue skies all the time. And then right at the end of March, it rained overnight, and it turned out that these were fall conditions. And I realized very soon that it wasn't going to be anything like as bad as I expected. Now, this is the first bird that I saw on that morning when I went out after the first rain in late March. And there were lots, maybe 30 of these birds in the garden, in the immediate adjacent garden. And I had no binoculars, and I was really almost panicked at the time, so I didn't know what they were. Were they mountain chiffchaffs, plain leaf warblers, Siberian chiffchaffs? Well, they all turned out to be Siberian chiffchaffs, and they were actually the most abundant warbler that I saw in Kabul. And they arrived, my earliest date for them was 28th of March, and they were present, passing through until the middle of May. And I got very familiar with them, with their call, with their song, and how they could look very different in different lights and depending on what vegetation they were in. Quite a tricky bird from that point of view if you're dealing with a vagrant in Britain. So there we are, the Siberian chiffchaff. And that you can see there that picture of a bird in the hand, it looks rather different to the previous one in coloration, but that's the rather typical Macintosh brown that you sometimes hear about. The next bird to arrive was this one, and these were present from very early April, again until the middle of May, and they were passing through also into Siberia. And this is Hume's leaf warbler, so a vagrant to Britain, much rarer than yellow-browed warbler, which was formerly considered a subspecies. And this was probably the second commonest Phylloscopus warbler that came through. A lovely little bird, and I ringed quite good numbers of them in the end. And I actually also found them much later on in very small numbers in the winter in Kabul. Now, Kabul's at 1,800 meters, and the temperatures go down regularly to -10 at night, and there can be very deep snow. So it's pretty amazing that these birds were surviving in winter. And I'm just going to ask you to allow me one very short, I think it's my only kind of diversion in this talk. I just want to say something about Alexander Octavian Hume, about after whom this species was named. There are 7 bird species named after Alan Octavian Hume, and he was an Indian civil servant in the Indian Civil Service in the middle of the 19th century. But he was a kind of 21st century person. He was many, many years ahead of his time, a quite extraordinary individual. He introduced free primary education for children in the area for which he was responsible. He promoted women's education. These things were considered very odd at the time. He started a Hindu journal, an Urdu journal. He made sure that delinquent juveniles were sent to schools rather than just flogged, and he promoted many agricultural reforms. And he was also a great botanist and ornithologist. He's known by many now as the father of Indian ornithology, although he was rather dogmatic, and some people call him the Pope of Indian ornithology. So there you go. And if that wasn't enough, he also was a founder of the Indian Congress movement, which of course eventually led to Indian independence, and he would have been very pleased to have seen independence come. So that's Hume. But back to the birds. So, or rather back to me. So I realized this was going to be potentially pretty exciting, but I had a very busy job, and I only had maybe an hour in the morning and a bit of time at weekends, although I was sometimes working at weekends as well. So I tried to use that time as best I could. The next bird to arrive, and these arrived very early in April, right at the beginning of April, at the same time as the Hume's leaf warblers. And you may or may not have guessed what this is, but it's actually a green warbler. Now these birds, many of them winter in Sri Lanka, and they migrate through to Iran, possibly some parts of Western Afghanistan, Turkey and the Caucasus. Very similar to Greenish Warbler, but in good lights, it has more yellow around on the supercilium, on the cheeks and on the throat. I have to say that a digital SLR camera doesn't pick up yellows very well, so this isn't quite a true representation of what a green warbler looks like. That's another picture which gives a slightly truer indication of just how bright the green warbler can look. And incidentally, its alternative name is bright green leaf warbler. And much, much later, so right at the end of April through to the 3rd week in May, these birds came through, and that is the similar but not quite identical Greenish Warbler. By comparison, if you've got them both in the hand, a Greenish Warbler looks much more pallid, much whiter below. There are some yellow feathers on the underparts, but they're only really visible if you've got the bird in the hand. So here's a Greenish Warbler in the hand. And there's a green warbler. You can see that the green warbler is a bit yellower around the cheeks and throat and the supercilium. But as I said, the camera that I was using, and I think most SLRs don't pick up the yellows quite as vividly as they actually are. Of course, it wasn't just warblers coming through. I was pleased to see red-breasted flycatchers. And because these birds were moving south from the southeast to the northwest, I expected them all to be red-breasted flycatchers rather than tiger flycatchers, and that was indeed the case. I ringed a few, and they were certainly all red-breasted flycatchers. But there's a lovely male in spring in some apple blossom. This species of warbler arrived from about mid-April, and it was coming through to mid-May. They were heading for Siberia. And it's a species that, if it looks pretty familiar, that's because it is familiar to most of us. It's a lesser whitethroat, but there are several subspecies of lesser whitethroat that could occur in Kabul, and I wasn't sure which one was involved, although I suspected that they were Blythi, and the first records of Blythi have recently been made in Sussex, just in the last few years. But I was able to send some feather samples to Professor Martin Collinson at Aberdeen University, and he did confirm that all the birds that I'd sent him samples of were Blyth's lesser whitethroat, and I suspect that all the lesser whitethroats of this particular part of the complex were Blythi. However, if you just note the brownness on the back of this lesser whitethroat, I'm just going to show you another bird. You can see that this is much grayer on the upper parts, throughout the upper parts, and this is often now considered a different species. It certainly is by the International Ornithological Congress. And this is Hume's whitethroat. It's sometimes called the mountain whitethroat. It breeds between 1,500 and 3,000 meters from Afghanistan through to Himachal in northwest India. They're pretty tricky, and I only identified a few of them. I think this is probably the only bird that I actually trapped and ringed. They are identifiable in the field, but they're not straightforward. So another non-warbler, I was hoping that blue throats would migrate through, and they started to come through in April, and it was obviously, as you can imagine, an absolute thrill to see them. If I was walking to work down my garden and you have blue throats hopping around at your feet, it's rather nice. So there's a blue throat, and I was able to ring some. This is a bird in the springtime with its apparently fresh plumage, but those feathers aren't actually, the feathers on the throat aren't actually its fresh new feathers, because it molts them in the autumn, and all of those feathers have white tips on them. And that makes the bird less conspicuous on its breeding grounds when it doesn't need to show its vivid colours. And all those white tips wear away over the winter period. So in spring, they look like the previous picture. It wasn't generally very fruitful to look up in the sky. If you were an aviation enthusiast, it was very fruitful because there were lots of interesting aircraft flying over, lots of Black Hawks and warthogs, if you know what that is, a lot of aircraft, but generally in spring, very few birds. On one occasion, however, there was an amazing snowstorm in the mountains around Kabul. And the next day, sort of mid-morning, I was looking up in the sky, and there was a flock of vultures soaring over my head. So I had to go to work. So I just blazed away with my camera and took about 50 photographs and then went to work and looked at the pictures in the days and weeks afterwards. So the two birds at the top left are Eurasian griffon vultures, and the bird at the bottom right is a black vulture. And that was particularly good to see because black vulture is classified by IUCN as near threatened. So it was good to have confirmation that they were up there in the mountains around Kabul. As I said, I didn't look at the pictures immediately, and it was actually some weeks later that I took a good look at this picture. And I realized that there weren't just Eurasian griffons, there were also Himalayan griffons in the flock. The bird at the top there is an immature Himalayan griffon, and you can see that it dwarfs even a Eurasian griffon. It is massive with those huge broad wings, a broader hand than a Eurasian griffon, and a duller, less rufous color on the underparts. And look at its remarkably small head. That's the Himalayan griffon vulture, and it's also near threatened. So that was again a good species to record. I was pleased to see it. So, as I said, it generally wasn't particularly fruitful looking overhead for migrating birds, and certainly not migrating raptors. I did see booted eagles, a very few greater spotted eagles. I saw steppe eagle, hen harrier, oriental honey buzzard, sparrowhawk, goshawk, black kite, long-legged buzzard, and shikra. One of the races of shikra does actually breed in Kabul, so I saw those as well. One of the things that perhaps is not unexpected about migrant birds arriving in Kabul in full conditions was that they sometimes occupied habitats where you really wouldn't expect them. And I don't know whether you've worked out what these are, but they were perched in pretty much the tallest tree they could find. It's actually a little group of Siberian stonechats on their way north. And I've never seen a stonechat perch up in the top of a tree like that. But they clearly decided that, given the options, that was the best one that they had available to them. I suspect what had happened is that they landed lower down. This was in a military base, and the military base suddenly got very busy, and they then flew up into the treetops. This species of warbler arrived around the middle of April again and was coming through until the middle of May. They were heading northwest as far as Eastern Europe, Romania, some of these birds go. And that is, of course, a paddy-field warbler, quite distinctive because of its very conspicuous supercilium. They're quite confiding birds. I managed to get quite close to them as well as ring some of them. And it's very nice to get to grips closely with a bird that is a vagrant to Britain. I think very few, possibly only one record in Sussex, for example. But by contrast, these birds were present in much larger numbers. This is a Blythi warbler. I'm just going to, yeah, no, that's fine. Blythi warbler, and they arrived from the second half of April, and they came through until early June. Slightly to my surprise, they came through quite late, and they were common. So they're going as far west as the Baltic states, Finland. I think they're even further west into Scandinavia now, and of course they're arriving in Britain in increasing numbers. Good to see. And I don't know whether you can see, if I use my mouse, I'm not sure if you can see this, the arrow. There are loads and loads of aphids there, so that's what was attracting this bird, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. This is a walnut tree. I was able to trap some Blythi warblers, and I took a lot of biometrics on the birds that I caught, and the bill length on some of the birds I was catching exceeded the published maxima, and that got me rather excited because there's an almost mythical bird called a large-billed reed warbler that I'm going to tell you about in just a second, and I was hoping that some of my birds might be large-billed reed warblers. That wasn't the case, but it was worth a try. So there we are, Blythi reed warbler. So on the left there is a spring Blythi reed warbler that I caught. It's actually already quite worn. It's molted on its wintering grounds, and its feathers are actually surprisingly worn and quite grey on the upper parts. But there on the right is the large-billed reed warbler. So a specimen was found in Himachal Pradesh in India in 1867, and then it vanished off the face of the earth, or appeared to, and nobody could work out where it came from, what it was, whether it really was a true species. But DNA did show that it was a true species, but still nobody could rediscover it. And then in March 2006, Professor Phil Round, who lives and works in Thailand, is a very famous ornithologist in Southeast Asia. He was ringing at a site, actually, I used to ring with him when I lived in Thailand on the upper part of the Thai Peninsula, and he caught the bird that you can see there on the right. And I'm not sure how many ornithologists and ringers would have been as switched on as Phil, because he recognized that this was something unusual. Its wing length to tail ratio is different from a Blythe reed, as well as the longer bill. And again, DNA analysis was done, and incredibly, the large-billed reed warbler had been rediscovered after about 140 years. An amazing story. And Phil actually retrapped the same bird in March 2008. So further work's been done, and it's been discovered that these birds breed in the Wakhan corridor, that finger of land that I show you in northeast Afghanistan. And they also breed in Tajikistan, and they probably breed in some of the other Central Asian republics as well. And other specimens have been found in museums that have been erroneously labeled as Blythe reed warblers. So the picture at the bottom there, bottom right, is the Blythe reed with a large billed reed that have been trapped in Bangladesh, and that may be one of their wintering grounds. So one of my little fantasies was to catch one, but it didn't happen. Still, it's a good story, the rediscovery of the large-billed reed warbler. Is this a large-billed reed warbler? Well, it perhaps looks a bit like one, but there's no size comparison. This bird's actually the size of a great reed warbler, and it's a clamorous reed warbler. And I was talking about aphids, and one remarkable thing about these warblers, you know, they've got this incredibly sort of hostile journey to do. They encounter bad weather conditions over Afghanistan, and they land in Kabul, in the middle of a city. But by sunrise, actually before sunrise, these birds had found the trees with the most aphids in. And I knew that because if it had rained overnight and I walked through the gardens, most of the warblers will be in the 1 or 2 walnut trees. And you can see this bird's, if I point the arrow, it's got an aphid in its mouth, and you can see there are lots of aphids on the tree here. So as I said, this is a walnut tree, and it was the best tree for the warblers to exploit. Another little story behind this bird. It's actually a common grasshopper warbler. So I was sitting on my balcony, the one with those grills that I showed you earlier, one morning reading a book, and this warbler flew through the grill and landed at my feet, and it hopped around for I think about 15 seconds. I was debating whether to try and catch it and ring it, and then it flew out again very sensibly and landed in a bush, and I was able to take this rather poor photograph. It was the only grasshopper warbler that I saw. Again, they winter in South Asia, and it would have been migrating up to central north or northwest Asia or Eastern Europe, possibly. A good bird to see, because they are very difficult to see, as you know, migrant birds, even in Britain. That was good. And just to say a little bit about the ringing, so I was very lucky that the Bombay Natural History Society was willing to provide me with rings. I did some refresher training at Stephen Rumsey's private ring site on the Sussex coast near Rye, so I'm very grateful to him, and to Ian Hunter and Phil Jones, who were working with Stephen, for Stephen, and also Phil Round provided me with a lot of help and advice as well. So yeah, nobody had ever been ringing in Kabul, and so I took a lot of biometrics on the birds that I was catching. That's a Hume's leaf warbler. If my fingers look a little bit injured, I think it's because the bird I ringed just before was a long-tailed shrike. And if you'd ring shrikes, you know that they can be pretty aggressive. So ringing was an opportunity for me to try and engage with young Afghans, and on a few occasions students from the university or staff from the UN Environment Programme were able to come round and join sessions, and they were absolutely fascinated by it. And it's to my lasting regret that I haven't been able to go back, or really nobody's been able to go back and continue this kind of work because of the security issues. Almost all of them were women, and I think they found it a great opportunity to get away from the kind of normal things that they were expected to be doing. You know, it was okay for them to go without a male chaperone to because they were coming to an embassy compound, and I was old enough to be called what's called in Afghan a whitebeard, so it was fine for them to come. And they were also supervised by the lady on the left, this German woman working for a non-government organization. And another thing I did was to help the UN Environment Programme set up a Kabul bird club. I don't know how active it still is, but I'm very grateful to members of the Sussex Ornithological Society who provided many pairs of binoculars and indeed even the telescope, which I was able to donate to this group, along with several copies of the Birds of Central Asia, which Nigel Redman very, very kindly provided. So these are small things, but maybe somewhere there's a little spark of inspiration that will have some impact in the future. So back to the birds. This is a terrible photograph. It's of the next warbler species that I found very rare. I only saw one, but others have been seen in Kabul, I know. And this is a Sulphur-bellied Warbler. It's a remarkable little Philoscopus warbler, but it clambers around on the trunks of trees and crawls over rocks. It doesn't behave like a normal Philoscopus warbler at all. And no surprise, therefore, that it actually breeds incredibly high up, between 2,500 and 4,500 meters up in the mountains, breeding on boulder-strewn slopes. And that kind of breeding habitat reflects the way it behaves in winter as well. So it's a lousy picture. Just one other thing to say about this bird. Anybody who reads their bird guides reports closely may recall that this bird was named as the craziest Western Palearctic vagrant of 2016, because one of them was found on the island of Christiansø in Denmark in 2016. I think that's possibly the only Western Palearctic record, certainly the only one that far away from its breeding grounds. It does breed in Afghanistan. It breeds in the mountains of Bamiyan, which are west of Kabul, and then the breeding range is, I think, further through to Ladakh in northwest India. It was not a bird I was expecting to find. Very distinctive call as well, by the way. So the next species, you probably recognize this, or could have 95% recognize it. This is, as you probably have guessed, a common whitethroat, but not quite as we know it. It's almost certainly of the eastern race Rubicola. And all the warblers I'm going to show you from now on are birds that I trapped in the autumn, by the way, rather than the spring. So how's it different from our whitethroat? Well, it's much grayer above, a bit like that Hume's whitethroat, actually, the bird that was similar to a lesser whitethroat. And obviously below are two more pictures of Rubicola whitethroats. The bottom right one was taken in Russia. I think I just downloaded that from the internet. But hang on, there's a slight catch here. And the catch is that bird bottom left, believe it or not, was photographed in Sussex. And it was wintering in a garden about a mile or two from my house last winter. But it was locked down and I couldn't go there. I couldn't attempt to catch it. I couldn't attempt to get any DNA. It was very, very galling. But I think that picture bottom left may well be Britain's first eastern whitethroat. I haven't attempted to submit it to BBRC or anything. I'm not sure they'd be interested, but if anybody thinks that this record should be pursued, please let me know. It's a pretty amazing record. There were two other warblers that I was expecting to find, and I eventually did, but only in the autumn and in very small numbers. This looks perhaps like a chiffchaff with milky tea tones, and it's often described as being milky tea in colour. This is a booted warbler, Iduna caligata, and I found very, very few of them, but I've been searching for them, so I was pleased when I did find them. So these, again, are moving a long way northwest in Asia and European Russia through, I think they're probably now breeding in Finland, and of course they occur as vagrants to Britain, and there have been some Sussex records, and that's the booted warbler. Warbler species number 13. And this one I found, I think, from right at the end of July until early September, again in very small numbers. Pretty tricky bird, Sykes warbler. It was considered a race of booted warbler, but is now considered to be a separate species, has been for many years actually. It's a tricky bird, very difficult to photograph, but good to find. So this is my favourite of all the warblers that I trapped. This is a Moustached Warbler, and like all the other birds that I've shown you in the hand, this one was trapped in that little 6-metre net in totally unsuitable habitat in my front garden. And again, it just shows you what birds will settle for if they can't find suitable habitat. A very kind of pretty bird in a kind of understated sort of way. So my final warbler is actually a bush warbler, and it only has 10 tail feathers, so that's a bit of a giveaway. And it is, of course, a Chetty's warbler. And I only caught one of these. So I saw 16 different species of warbler in a tiny area of gardens where, when I'd arrived, I thought that I may see none. And remember, this is a tiny microcosm of Afghanistan, just one tiny area within a city in a country larger than France. So kind of, it was brilliant, but also incredibly frustrating, you know, thinking what was out there. And to find out what was out there, you know, I was relying on all sorts of sources of information. And this is one source, just reading a newspaper article. So there's quite a big breeding and release program for Hubara busters in Tajikistan, and they have satellite transmitters on. And this bird with its satellite sort of cable was seen by the Afghan police, who promptly shot it as they thought it was a sort of a Taliban suicide bomber, believe it or not. Another way I could find out what birds were around, I wasn't allowed to walk around the city, but I was sent photographs. So this is a sad picture. These are all black-bellied sandgrouse, and then on the left there you can see some common cranes, all of which are being sold as food. I was also shown pictures of great black-headed gull in breeding plumage, shot and being sold as duck, larks, and then among live birds, many buntings and finches, such as rose finches and red-headed buntings, and also sparrowhawks being offered for sale, presumably maybe for falconry or maybe just a kind of fashion accessory. I'm not quite sure. So summer came around, and summer was really pretty quiet in Kabul. I did have long-tailed shrikes breeding in the garden, which was very nice. There's a family of young birds with one of the adults in a mulberry tree. Indian golden oriole, it looks pretty much like our golden oriole. It is a different species, Oriolus kundu. They breed in Kabul, and obviously the song is a delight to hear. And the call of this bird could be heard through the summer as well. And this is one that I caught in that net, a hoopoe. So that was rather nice. But in general, the summer was a pretty quiet time, and you know, I did other things. I got into baking and carpets. I bought the carpet at the bottom right is actually a little insert I pasted into that slide. It's a Turkmen sort of thing called a chuval if you're into carpets. It was a lovely one, and I bought it off the carpet seller. And I asked him where he got it from, hoping that he'd say he'd gone to a remote village in northern Afghanistan and managed to persuade a tribal leader to sell it to him. He said, no, my uncle bought it in Paris. So it obviously was made in northwest Afghanistan or Turkmenistan, but it had been to Paris in the meantime. But there you go. So autumn came, late summer, early autumn, and there was more diurnal migration. It's actually better in the autumn than in the spring. There were European rollers, alpine swifts, Eurasian bee-eaters, and also I was deciding how to complete this slide and what to put in the top right, and I eventually decided on steppe buzzard, and I put the slide together, and I thought I'd better just check to see what the status of steppe buzzard is in Afghanistan. And so I looked it up, and it's not on the Afghan list, so I guess I ought to be writing a little note for the SANDGROUSE, the ornithology bulletin of the Journal of the Ornithological Society of the Middle East, the Caucasus and Central Asia. Although I can't believe it really was the first record for Afghanistan. Anyway, This was another attempt by me at a first record for Afghanistan. It's not the most amazing thing to get a first record for Afghanistan, given how poorly studied the country is. This was a red-backed shrike in my garden. These winter in Africa, by the way. And I prepared a note as the first record, but I've subsequently discovered that there were at least 2 previous records. It hadn't been recorded in Afghanistan until the 2000s, but it's presumably a regular migrant. So I'm just drawing to a close here. So just to say that in autumn, most of the same warblers came back through. And this is another picture of a Siberian chiffchaff, just to show you how different they can look. And why the bird in this picture looks so green, I don't know. It's presumably because of the vine leaves all around it. There are a few different things came in late summer. Rose-coloured starling, very much a sort of wandering bird, perhaps not surprising that they turned up in small numbers on their way to the subcontinent. And only saw one of these, a spotted flycatcher. This is another one of the smaller number of migrants that go to Africa. So this would come from Central Asia and was on its way back to Africa. And one of the last birds that I saw, a migrant, probably really an altitudinal migrant to some extent, is the crag martin. And these were still present in Kabul, remarkably, in mid-November. So there we are. I just want to stress again that, you know, it was a tiny little microcosm of the whole of Afghanistan that I was studying. The country has 15 important bird areas. One of them, Khoi Hashmat, is a wetland in Kabul that's under very severe threat at the moment. It used to hold breeding black-necked grebes. I don't know whether it still does. But there are other important wetlands and steppe areas, mountains of very great importance to birds. And one of the wetlands used to be a migratory stopover for the central Siberian population of Siberian white cranes, where they come through from Siberia through this lake Abi Estada in central Afghanistan, through to Bharatpur in India. And I actually took that picture in Bharatpur many, many years ago. And those are possibly the last 2 extant, were at the time the last 2 Siberian cranes from the Central Asian population. So my tour ended 2 years, and I flew out over those beautiful mountains to Dubai. It was a pretty tough 2 years, and it was I felt a weight coming off my shoulders as the aircraft took off. So if you want to learn anything more about what I've been talking about, there is a paper that you can freely download that I wrote for SANDGROUSE, and also in an earlier issue of SANDGROUSE there's another paper that was written about another area of Afghanistan. You know, there's a huge amount there. There are snow leopards up in the Wakhan corridor, you know, wolves, many other wonderful birds and animals. It's a shame that it's so difficult to get there. So there we are. I'll finish there. And I'm just going to pass over now to Martin Orchard-Webb, who I can see there are 1 or 2 questions, and Martin's going to test me to see if I know the answers.
Well, great talk, Mark. Thank you very much. It's really encouraging to see we can still continue with our hobby even under the most difficult of conditions. A few questions. One here from Rob. He said, did you ever get any ring recoveries for the birds you ringed in Kabul?
I should have, sorry, I meant to say that. I didn't. I ringed about 300, which is a fairly small number to ring and expect to get a result. You look at what the people at Ngulir in East Africa ring to get a single recovery. The odds were never very high, but no, I didn't.
Okay. And another one here from Mike, with so many small birds around, what would have been their main predators?
I don't think they have many predators. There are a lot of feral cats, and I had to shoo them away from my mist nets. So I'd say feral cats, and then migrating sparrowhawks and the resident shikras. They're probably the main predators.
Okay. Another question, has any further ornithological research been carried out recently?
The main piece of research that I know about was done in 2008 in a mountainous area, which is a protected area in Bamiyan province, which is west of Kabul. And you can download the papers on that also from SANDGROUSE. It's volume 31, number 2, if you're interested. But some amazing mouth-watering species in those mountains. I was so envious that I couldn't go there. And also, I should say, by the way, up in the Wakhan corridor in the northeast, the place that I mentioned a couple of times, the Wakhan corridor, there's been research into snow leopards going on by the Wildlife Conservation Society, US conservation body, but I'm pretty certain that they also take detailed ornithological records as well, although I haven't tried to find them. I'm not sure whether they're published.
Okay, another question, Mark. Are there any endemic species?
No, there's one near endemic, which is the Afghan snowfinch, but sadly for Afghanistan, it's also been found in Tajikistan, so not quite.
And the final question I have is it still safe to visit, or is it safe at all to visit?
No, but please don't go to Afghanistan. Yeah, it is not safe, and it's not going to get any safer in the near future. So please don't go. It's a great shame because there's a backlog of decades of conservation field work that needs to be done, and it would be a great way of engaging Afghan people, promoting tourism. There's a win-win opportunity out there that unfortunately we can't really take at the moment.
Okay, there is one other question, Mark, and it's from Amanda, which is a more personal nature, and I think probably we could take that separately offline.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody. That's the last in the current series of Sussex Ornithological Society talks. With the coming of spring and the ending of full lockdown, we're not going to have regular talks from now on until we get to July, when there is going to be a wonderful talk about Alaska. So if you look on Eventbrite or the Sussex Ornithological Society in the near future, you'll find details of that. And then we'll be doing white-tailed eagles next winter. So thank you very much indeed for joining, and enjoy the rest of your evening. And thank you very much, Martin, for doing the Q&A. Martin is my assistant recorder in the Sussex Ornithological Society, as I should have said. Thanks very much indeed, everybody. Bye-bye.